Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm here in the studio with Steve Durbin, Managing Director, to talk today about data breach response. Steve, good to be talking with you today, as always. Given the risks that cybersecurity threats pose in a technology-driven global economy, there's increasing pressure on IT and security leaders to not just protect the company's reputation, stock price, and valuable information such as personally identifiable info, PII, and intellectual property, but also to ensure that adequate steps are put in place to respond to any data breaches. It's now clear that the question isn't if there will be a breach, but when a company will face a breach. So, Steve, there's no doubt the impact of a data breach on an organization can be hugely detrimental, and most organizations are going to face a breach at some point. In order for an organization to respond effectively, what do you think the steps are that organizations should be taking prior to a breach taking place?
I think one of the key steps, Tavia, is to actually play out what a breach would look like for your organization. So run a simulation exercise. That will enable you, I think, to really get a feel for who needs to be involved, at what point, when, and effectively you're rehearsing for the day that you hope will never come. And I think you have to do that on an ongoing basis. So when I talk to ISF members, for instance, there are some out there who will be rehearsing that, regularly on an annual basis. They're producing playbooks so that they can run through, so that they can learn from the actual simulation that they're running within their own organization. But I think perhaps much more importantly, so that they can also take into account the way in which other organizations have responded that have been breached, where that information is available, either in the public domain or indeed where it has been shared within a secure environment, such as some of the events that the ISF runs, for instance. So I think that running a cyber simulation is fundamental. At the moment, we're working with our members all around the world in terms of coming up with what that should look like. What does good look like in that particular space? The playbook is fundamental, again, to really understanding who does what, where, and when. And this is an instance where the business needs to be very actively involved. Mm-hmm. When you have a breach, depending on the nature of that breach, you are inevitably going to have to confront the press, shareholders, customers, employees at some point in time. Very often, that is not at a point in time of your choosing. So the CEO, traditionally, if it's a large-scale breach, is really going to have cameras thrust in their face, particularly if you happen to work for a large organization, at a time when he or she probably doesn't have all of the information to hand. And so how do you deal with that? You're only going to be able to be effective in dealing with that if you run a simulation. And research has shown that in those early days, post-breach becoming widely known, the way in which an organization handles that has a very significant impact on its ability to recover, the speed of recovery, and indeed the public perception of the way in which that organization has both handled the breach, but also had handled the way in which it had protected information and its systems prior to the breach as well. So it isn't something that you want to practice for the first time when the event has happened.
Right. So this is all about protecting data, Steve. And nowadays, organizations are storing their data in the cloud, and they even have multiple data centers across the world. I would imagine that would make it extremely difficult to identify and locate a data breach and respond effectively and efficiently to it. Do you have any advice or best practices for IT and security professionals to help manage that complicated task?
It is a complicated task, and it's becoming very much more difficult because we share so much data and we create so much data second by second throughout the working day. I think for most organizations, you have to start with really assessing where your most critical information lies. You can't, unfortunately, hope to protect every element of information across your enterprise at every moment of the day. So you have to start by making sure that the critical information is protected. How do you identify what that is? Well, for most organizations, it's going to be information that if it were to fall into the wrong hands or if it were to be lost, would really have a detrimental impact on your business, bring it to a grinding halt effectively. So what does that look like? Where is that being stored? You may determine, for instance, that some of that is being held in a public cloud. Now, you may decide, in line with whatever risk appetite that you have adopted for the organization, that perhaps that isn't the place that you would want it to be. Perhaps you would want to take it down from that and store it within your own private environment. But it's those sorts of things that you need to be working through. And we shouldn't forget that many organizations didn't just start business yesterday. They have gradually been assembling and adding to all of this data over a very long period of time. And so we shouldn't underestimate the size of the challenge in terms of, trying to establish where some of this data is being held and how it's being used and managed and stored and so on. So it is a large task. We call it protecting the crown jewels at the ISF. There is a process in place that we've shared with our members for doing that. And I think that's a good place for most organizations to start. What is critically important? What is the critical asset that you need to be protecting, and what level of protection is it receiving? Once you've done that, you can then begin to work back to see how you protect other elements of information across your enterprise. Some of it will be sitting with third parties. You do really need to understand the level of protection that a third party is applying to that data as well. Mm-hmm. How clear are you being about specifying the different levels of data protection that are required for some of the information that's being shared with third parties? How are you checking on that?
Right.
Are you asking them to self-audit, for instance? You may well do if some of the information isn't of critical importance. If it's more important, you may want to go on site and do some of that audit yourself. All of these things I think are steps that organizations are taking and need to continue to take in order to reassure themselves that information that is being shared, that is being stored, has the appropriate level of control and security around it. Now, is that going to prevent a breach taking place? Probably not, is the reality.
Right.
If we look at some of the breaches that have taken place recently, they tend to be because things have happened that you hadn't expected. So it may be a third party that has managed to gain access to a system. It may be because you haven't patched appropriately. It may be because a user has clicked on an attachment when they shouldn't have done. And so we get into, all elements of cyber hygiene around these different things. And I think what we're seeing is a move away from, certainly with a lot of organizations, to saying, okay, given that we know that a breach is going to take place, how do we protect that critical information? And how do we then recover from it? So what is the process that we need to have in place in order to get back up and running as quickly as possible and to limit the damage? Because we probably can't prevent a breach taking place. It's going to happen. But what is very important is how you respond to that. And so I'm back into now that whole sort of cyber simulation, which really needs to take into account your resilience ability and the speed at which you can get systems back up and running.
Well, it sounds also like it's of great importance to be a member of an organization like the ISF so that you can share best practices or what doesn't work, what has been successful, what has been less successful, and have that community of information sharing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that certainly the ISF provides that environment, as you know, Tavia. There are other organizations out there as well. The ISACs do that, particularly FS ISAC, if you happen to be in the financial services space. I think the important thing is that you do have an industry body or a place that you can go where you can share some of this best practice, where you can actually understand, how other people are putting together some of their cyber simulation exercises, putting in place some of the resilience features around the way in which they can get back up and running. And indeed, I think how they are dealing with some of the third parties, because if you're looking at it from an industry sector standpoint, you may well find that there's commonality across those third parties. And that may save you and the third party some time in terms of assessing their ability to really safeguard your information and indeed recover from a breach when it happens.
And really, time is the most pressing thing, right? You want to get your business back up and running. You want to communicate in a timely way with people. Time is of the essence.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're trying to do when a breach happens is you're trying, of course, to isolate it if you can. You're trying to ensure that You can get back up and running, as you rightly point out, that you can assess the extent of the damage and that you can communicate that. Communication is fundamental at a time of a breach. And it is across your own organization because, of course, everybody is going to be asked about it. It is with customers. It is publicly if it's of relevance there, or indeed if word has got out. Certainly under the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, of course, if it involves the loss of personal information, then you're going to have to be informing the Information Commissioner within a very short space of time. So this all then really leads into, do you have the external third-party support that you need? Mm-hmm. Do you have the forensic support that you can call upon? What's your PR looking like? Have you run through that? Has legal been involved in your cyber simulation exercise? What about HR? Have they been involved too? Because there's a strong people element in all of this as well. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about cyber simulation, when it relates to a breach, there are the technical components around forensics. There's the notification around ICO, perhaps law enforcement. But there is also a whole range of components there that perhaps people might not think about. PR, HR, legal, and so on. And that really is the benefit of running a cyber simulation exercise, because you can get all of those people together, run through it, determine pieces that worked well, the pieces that didn't, and capture that into your playbook going forward.
Mm. So let's shift the conversation a bit to a scenario in which the breach has occurred. Depending on the size of the breach and how sensitive the information is that has been compromised, should an organization's breach response be proportionate to the size of the breach?
I don't think you should necessarily set out with that in mind. I think that you have a response to a breach. Once you get into that, you will then unpick the overall extent to it. With a lot of breaches, unfortunately, it's impossible to know right at the outset the full extent of the damage. Forensics can take a significant amount of time. Very often people will say to me, well, why is it that we're only hearing about a breach, months after it's happened? Well, the reality is that there probably wasn't enough information available earlier on. And what you don't want to do is to go out there, make statements that you're going to regret. So fully understanding the extent of a breach and how long it's going to take you to get back up and running and so on is not something that it's easy to estimate at the beginning. So I'm not in favor of having different levels of breach response. I am in favor of having a breach response process that you have that allows you to either shorten it once you begin to discover the full extent of the damage, or indeed extend it, depending again on what you're uncovering. But we have to understand that is not something that you're going to do within the first 5 minutes or half an hour. It's going to take days. Mm-hmm. And therein lies the real challenge, I think, with some legislation that requires you to report a breach within a very, very short space of time, because you don't have all of the information available. And this is why you have to run a pretty comprehensive cyber simulation exercise, because you have to run through the different things that you're going to be able to say and to have rehearsed that. Because when it does happen, there are going to be a large number of unknowns, and you have to be credible in that space. You have to ensure that people feel reassured that you have a process, at least, that allows you to assess the extent of the damage, and that you have a fallback as well as to how you're then going to remediate and get back up and running.
Let's talk a little bit about a company that loses credibility. If a corporation mismanages a breach, their breach response, and they lose trust with their customer, their end user, is there any coming back from such a misstep?
Well, we used to talk about the fact that when a breach happened, the stock would take a dip and that would have a significant impact. And it does short term, there's no questions. But stock, we know now, recovers. The speed at which it recovers is dependent upon the way in which you handle the breach. Inevitably, I think, people are going to make mistakes. How do you wind that back? That is a very difficult one. If you look at, the impact of any of these things from a reputational standpoint, from a brand perspective, it is almost impossible, I would say, to be able to really assess that. It's somewhere that you don't really want to go, because recovering from it is going to be a very long, hard slog. But again, I think in your simulation, you need to be preparing for that. When you run a simulation, you shouldn't be assuming that you're going to get it right throughout the process. Mm-hmm. You need to be throwing some things in there
Complicating it,
exactly. That says, okay, the CEO has got in front of a camera and actually he or she has said something that they didn't really want to say.
Yeah.
It happens. How do we now recover from that? What is the process that we have in place to recover from that? So I think that there are some great technology-based simulation exercises out there that allow you to throw these sort of wild cards in to the team that you've got working through this simulation. Other things, allow you to do it from a tabletop standpoint. But some of the ones that I really do like is it gives you that ability to be able to just chuck this in, and because you can throw things at people in the moment, see how they respond, and then develop your playbook around that. I think it's also very important if you're changing personnel. So, for instance, if you've got if your front man is the CEO and you've had a change in CEO, you shouldn't be waiting too long before you're running it again with the incoming CEO, for instance, and that applies at all of the different key levels of people who are going to have to play an active role in responding to a breach.
Mm-hmm. As we know, global organizations hold and share data with many third-party suppliers. In the event of a breach, how should companies be managing their multiple third parties to ensure those relationships aren't damaged permanently?
Yeah, I think it's about really trying to understand whether or not those third parties have been impacted in any way. So this comes back to the data again, and having a clear understanding of where the data is sitting, who it's being shared with, how any potential loss of that information or corruption of that information might impact a third party is really fundamental as to how you then go forward. In the happiest of scenarios, you're going to be able to go to your third parties, of course, and say, look, this situation has arisen. The data that's been affected isn't a set that we've shared with you. And so you can reassure them. That is equally as important as saying to them, this breach might have affected you. Mm. So I think it really does come back to having a good understanding of the way in which information flows across your extended corporate network, including the third parties that are out there, and being able to point a finger as precisely as possible at where the breach has occurred, the impact that it has had, and then notify all parties accordingly, letting those know that have been impacted what they need to do, letting those know that haven't been impacted that they don't necessarily need to do anything. All of those things are as important as each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like the probability of a data breach is not just likely, but something that most organizations should be anticipating. IT and security professionals must ensure their plans and their systems are in place that will help identify data breach incidents as quickly as possible, whether the data is mission-critical information or that of their third parties. The first step is knowing when a real breach incident has taken place and how valuable the information is that has been compromised. But most importantly, what immediate actions need to take place to reduce the risk of major data implications. For more information, such as the ISF Supply Chain Assurance Framework, IRAM-2 risk methodology, and protecting the crown jewels, check the Information Security Forum website, which can be found at securityforum.org. Thanks again, Steve.